Hey guys, so this week something really special happened. The channel got to 10,000 subscribers, which really means a lot to me. I did not start this channel ever expecting it to get this big. So it really means a lot that like now the channel is at a point where it's actually like making money from AdSense, and that still kind of blows my mind. So this week I thought I would just make a very practical, straightforward video. A really clickbaity version of it is the big issues I see people making in productions, but really a better way of phrasing it would be departments of production that may need to be enhanced if you want to achieve more of a higher production sound. So what I would encourage you to do is watch through this video and keep tabs of the different departments that I talk about and just appraise your current demos where they are at and see if maybe one of these departments you feel like you're lacking a little bit in, because then I feel like you have like a framework of things that you can work on. And I'll try to be like as explicit as possible as what I would recommend people would do in these certain steps. But yeah, we're going to go through really quickly the things that I think keep people from having quote unquote professional sounding demos, as somebody who gets demos sent to me every week. But with that, let's jump into it. Also, in case this is your first time watching, I do produce People as a freelancer. So if you think we would have fun working on a project together, the top link is in the description. So this is the song that I made live on video last week. In case you didn't catch it, this is what it sounds like.
Oh, think I understand where I am, how to make it back again. I'm not searching for myself, he's refining who I am. Hate the way I drop the ball, but I pick it up again. Not avoiding all my issues, I'm addressing what I can.
So that's what the production sounds like. Again, this is kind of a demo that I made, but I thought I would just answer some questions that some people had about, it's like, all right, how do you get tracks to sound good? Or I'm struggling with the track that I have right now. What would you recommend? I feel like a lot of them tend to have a lot of the same problems. So I figured I would use this beat as an example of what I think most people struggle with. So I think the first one that jumps out to me is sound selection. When you're producing a track, you really need to be picky about your sound selection. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about, when I say sound selection, is most of the time the initial sound that they've recorded is just not actually what they want to use. So an example of that would be like this bass sound that I've recorded. You can see that there's a lot of like low end in that sound, but I recorded it with a P bass specifically because I wanted sort of that like sort of higher mid-range sound that you get from a P bass. I could have equally gone for something that was a synth bass that had a little bit more like sub low end in it. And I even have a little bit of like the sub bass boosted on like the CLA bass plugin that I'm using to mix it a little bit, but I am adding a little bit of a subby texture to this P bass sound because at its core, I wanted a bass sound that felt like a live band playing. When it comes to live band bass playing, I'm really drawn to the way that a P bass sounds. But it would be really destructive if I was trying to get like a Reese 808 style amount of low end out of that P bass. Like I could boost the sub on this, I could boost the sub here, I can even add like a sub harmonic plugin like Infinity Bass and try to get that P bass to sound like it is a synth bass. But at that point, I would rather just like find a synth bass and just replace this bass sound because it's not giving me what I want from a track. When I'm picking the sound that I want at the start, I'm doing a lot of the legwork in terms of mixing or just getting everything to lock in with each other. And what I see a lot of people doing wrong is getting something like an amp sim that's a little bit too crispy, that's a little bit too high-end heavy, and then every single time they use it, they have to like cut out a bunch of like the 4K range, which normally you have to do with the guitar, but it's like an excessive amount of like resonant 4K range that's like specific to that plugin. Or they're like trying to use drum samples that aren't in the genre that they're making, and so they're either having to cut a lot of low end out or add a lot of low end in. And like I said, there's a way for you to be flexible with it, like I did with this CLA bass, but for most people, you've got to be at least in the ballpark of the sound that you're trying to get preset right at the start. So what I would recommend is looking at the genres that you are producing most often, whether that's EDM, indie pop, or whatever, and then look at what are the instruments that you're constantly using all the time. Are you constantly having to reach for Reese basses? Are you constantly needing analog style Juno synths? Do you constantly need heavy guitar tones? And just start writing those elements out, and then make it your homework to go through all of your plugins, all of your presets, and then be like, what is like my favorite version of this sound, so that you can pull that up as a preset. Like everybody knows, I'm constantly using this Andy in a bottle preset in Guitar Rig, and it's not because there's something magical about this preset. And I really like the way that this preset sounds. And so when I'm in that creative flow and I'm like, I need a chorusy, like kind of light, crunchy guitar tone to use with my Strat, I have a place where I can go to get that. And I'm not building that from scratch every time. And it might end up being you need to buy something like a sample pack that has the specific kinds of drum sounds that you're looking for, or you need to buy like a synth preset pack in the genre that you're looking for. Like start building out a solid foundation of sounds that you know sound good in most of the stuff that you're going to be working on, and then use that foundation so that you can be like, okay, I have this Reese bass that I really like from the Make Pop Serum pack, and I really like these Volcano drums from Oversample. Those are like my bed elements that I know sound good. They have the low end that I need for the genre that I do. Now I can be a little bit more creative with like the guitar loop or the lead synth or the vocal sample, but you have that like bed foundation of stuff you know sounds good. The second thing that I think a lot of people would benefit from in the production world is knowing how to tweak stuff. So I just talked about the presets that I recommend a lot of people use. And if I'm being completely honest, I am not somebody who like completely understands every single facet of every plugin that I use, but I have developed a very extensive knowledge on the practical side of tweaking things. So an example of this would be Vital. I do not by any stretch of the imagination understand everything that Vital does. All right, if you've watched a Venus Theory video on Vital, you know that there's like an insane amount of things that it can hypothetically do. So when you're working in the world of like songwriting or production, understand you don't really need to know how everything works. So like, for example, if I like this Make Pop Music Synergy sample pack and I find a keys patch that I like, I could be like, okay, that's pretty close to what I want, but I actually would like it to be a little bit darker. I know that I can grab the filter cutoff here and bring it down. Maybe a little bit more. And now I can be like, okay, that's the sound that I was looking for. And the reason I was able to make a tweak like that instead of leaving it at is because I've learned the basics of how synths work, and I don't 100% understand every interface of every synth that I use, but I know the basic elements of like, okay, here's how an oscillator works. This is where the oscillator section is. This is what 90% of the sound that I'm using right now is based off of. Here's the filter section, and then here's the envelopes, and that's how you control those elements. So I have the very basic building blocks of how a synth works, but even just knowing those few things, here's what an oscillator is, here's what a filter does, and here's what envelopes do. Already, that is enough knowledge for me to go into something like this Juno patch from Arturia and look for those same elements of like, okay, here is the oscillator section. Let me try a different oscillator. And then, okay, let me look for the filter, VCF, voltage controlled filter. All right, if I bring this down, and then I want it to have a short cutoff. Okay, envelope is over here. Bring the release down. Fast attack. And then I don't really like the effects that were on this, so let's turn off the effects. Like, I've completely changed the sound, but really from a synth guru standpoint, or somebody who really knows how synths work, like Venus Theory or Ben Jordan, I really haven't done anything that complicated. In fact, I've made very, very small tweaks, but that has had a massive impact on the vibe of this patch. You know, I would say learn some very basic knowledge on how to tweak a synthesizer, learn the very basic of how an amp works, and pick one element and just YouTube it for a bit and be like, okay, this week I'm gonna learn how a compressor pedal on an amp can be used. I'm gonna learn the way that some people like using it, the way that other people don't like using it, and just start learning small snippets of it one by one, because what you'll start to realize is it's actually not necessary for you to understand everything in order to get what you want. Like, you don't need to have the same knowledge you would need to know as like, okay, if I'm picking a guitar tone, I need to get to the same level of knowledge as somebody who's been miking guitar amps in a studio for 20 years. It's like you can very easily have just a basic functioning knowledge of, okay, here's how to turn things off that I don't like, or here's how I can refine the sound that I have a little bit more in the direction that I'm looking for. And again, like I said before, a lot of that is just picking the right sound at the start. But yeah, it's really not necessary for you to know how everything works. You just need to know like the bare bones stuff. And even the more advanced stuff will become a lot more clearer to you and a lot more simple once you have a handle on the basic stuff. And then I think the third thing that a lot of people's productions would benefit from would be mixing. So here is the rubber bridge guitar that I used in the last video. So what I think a lot of people would benefit from is a very simple process for how to make stuff like this that's a little bit in the demo stage sound nice without necessarily going off the deep end of trying to get aggressive with mixing. So some ways that I approach that is one, EQ. I tend to use the stock Ableton EQ for a lot of stuff. And the way that I have it set up is actually pretty minimal compared to what it starts out as. You can see I have a high pass filter, a couple of bells, and then a high shelf. And the reason that I've organized the EQ points that way is because that's similar to what you get on like a vintage style EQ. And I think that for sort of a vibe mix, it's a lot more practical for you when you're in the production stage to almost abandon the idea of dialing in the mix perfectly when you're in writing phase, so that you can just do like a couple of small moves to tighten things up the way that you need to tighten them up and then move on so that you can keep producing. So for this guitar, I'll bring up the high pass filter. I'm just gonna bring it up until I hear like the super low graveliness go away. Pull it back so that some of it comes back. And then, yeah, I'm just gonna use these two EQ points. That sounds a little bit harsh, so let me duck it down a tiny bit. Again, not even doing crazy moves. It's like a couple dB. And then it's a little bit of a brighter guitar tone. So let me look at some of the high end. That 2K range doesn't sound great. I'm going to do a tiny bit of a cut there. And then I don't really feel like doing anything with that top end boost. Again, we haven't done anything crazy with it, but it plays a little bit nicer with the mix because now there's not like the insane low end rumble that was happening before. Some of like the more troublesome frequencies are a little bit more even. And then I would honestly combine that with something like a limiter. And for this step, I normally recommend people just use whatever is stock in their DAW. Like if you need to use a limiter, use your stock limiter. If you need compression, use your stock compressor, because you can actually get most of the work done using that, at least in that initial songwriting production stage. So what I'm going to do now is bring the ceiling down on this limiter so that these like peaks of the guitar's performance are like evened out. So it's just pulling it down a little bit. Actually, I'm not even going to use the compressor here. So here, I've put it all in a group, and then I've added a little bit of a utility to sort of make up for the volume difference that we're getting here. But so here's what it sounds like with it on. And then here's with it off. On again. Again, not like a crazy night and day difference, but when you're slowly doing stuff like this over all of your tracks, like having an occasional, okay, there's a high pass filter, or I want to boost a little bit of 100 hertz on this snare, or I want to cut some of the high end out of this synth. Like little tiny moves like that over the course of an entire track actually makes a huge difference. And I think the more simple you keep it, the better. I'm very much an advocate for when you are in the writing process, you shouldn't be doing really labor intensive mix work, like have a separate step after the song is finished where you go back and you do all that stuff. But when it comes to actually like finishing the song, working on the track, filling out the production, try to keep your mixing as minimal as possible. I think another thing that really holds back people's productions is just their main levels, if I'm being honest. Like if your main vocal is not loud enough, or your kick is too loud, or your snare is too loud, it's just there's very little chance of the thing that you like coming through the way that you want it to come through. So for example, if I pull up Paz frequency analyzer here and I just play the main drop.
How to contend, how to stand. No, I'm limping when I walk, but I was crawling on the sand.
So you can see that like it's a little bit bass heavy, which I was fine with. And then there's a kind of a flatter mid-range and then a bit of a larger dip. That's just because there's not a whole lot of like high-end elements in the track. And for indie pop, I feel like it gets a little bit darker here. If you listen to like anything from the new 1975 record, there's like almost like a cut here. But from this, we can see like the elements are kind of where they need to be. Or at the very least, I can look at this and see where I want things to be and be like, yeah, that's where I generally want them to be. But I don't know, let's cut our kick drum a bit, move our snare up a little bit too much, kind of move the drums a little bit, pull the bass, boost the guitar a little bit. A lot of these moves that I'm making right now are like, I don't know, a few dB here or there. But if we go to it now, you can see like the graph has like drastically changed. We don't have anywhere near the amount of high end that we did. And then this whole stuff is kind of out of whack. Again, you might like this newer balance a bit more than me, depending on your taste. But what I feel people struggle with really early on is trying to find the balance of the elements that they already have and not overemphasize the kick or underemphasize the kick or things like that. So I think that spending your time looking at songs in the style that you do and just even throwing like a frequency analyzer like this on a similar track to something that you're working on, you don't need to make your track match the frequencies of your reference. I'm not suggesting you do that, but what I'm saying is it can sometimes provide some insight into some pitfalls that you might be falling into. Maybe you're working on a style where there isn't really a lot of like sub low end, but then every time you throw this analyzer on your mix, you notice there's like an insane amount of like sub low end. And that could be addressing something like, okay, well, maybe I can't hear the low end enough in the mixing situation that I'm in. But I think like balances is one of those things where it can be really finicky. So it's really easy for people to get lost in it. And on some level, even like paid projects that I'm doing all the time, we're constantly having a conversation about levels. Like how loud is the snare? How loud is the vocals? The relationships between things like the vocals and all of the mid-range elements like the guitars. The balance between the drum kit as a whole and the bass. Between all of the instrumental and all of the vocals. Like these are relationships that are like not really a science. You kind of have to vibe it out a little bit and just feel it. But I feel like at least feeling it and being like, okay, what do I like about it? What do I not like about it? And then looking at it with a frequency analyzer can help you get unstuck. I think another thing that can really help level up people's productions is sort of like a stock mastering chain. And the reason why I say this is because I think a lot of people are getting underwhelmed by the beats that they have or the instrumentals that they're making because they're comparing them to mastered tracks. And they're like, well, my beat's not pumping the way that theirs is pumping, or I feel like mine isn't as loud as theirs. And most of that is just through a mastering chain. Again, I don't think you need to use like a full blown, like all of your mastering plugins or running Ozone while you're still producing it, but it can be really helpful to have something like this, which is just like a default Ableton mastering chain. That's 4 plugins. It's a EQ, a couple compressors, and a limiter, and just throwing that on a track to get it leveled out. So here, if I turn the track down, you can hear it, like the beat sounds different. And when I turn this chain on, like everything kind of comes up a little bit more. I'm basically doing the same thing, just a little bit of a high pass filter, a couple of EQ points to cut ranges that I think are not really flattering in the song, like maybe a dB, half a dB. I'm normally using a couple compressors just because I like compressed stuff. So I have this mastering compressor that's kind of triggering off of the snare. also adding a little bit of soft clipping. And then after that, I throw on another compressor that's just sort of a general like, okay, now that the snare has been caught, because I do like mixes where the snare is a little bit louder than everything, runs into the compressor a little bit more and it makes the whole song duck a bit. That's something I picked up from Misha from Periphery. I like that vibe. So now that it's kind of leveled out from that, so I've boosted my snare into the compressor. This first compressor has like a high pass filter, so it's only looking at like the snare. I now have another compressor to sort of add a little bit of like gentle compression on top of that. And then running it into a limiter. And you can hear like even just a little bit of work like that can make this like demo that is like an unfinished song actually have a little bit more life to it than it did before. So yeah, I would recommend going through your DAW and making like a really basic mastering chain like this that maybe you throw on like 60% of the way through, just to like get a little bit more perspective on how is the mix going to be interacting with the mastering chain, or just I want the vibe of like a mastered track while I'm working on this right now, even if I don't want to like master it per se. I think another element that is really important is thinking of your productions in terms of parts versus textures. So here's an example. I have this bass line here. And I thought when I was working on this song after that video, you know, I want that next section, I want the bass to pop out a little bit more. So what I did was I duplicated that bass track through the DI onto a different patch that has more of like a fuzz sound to it, high passed it using that like default Ableton EQ setup that I was talking about before, and then running it into a chorus. And so that sounds like this. It's almost like Jack Whitey, but then I layered it underneath the main bass sound, and it sounds like this. And I just really liked the way that it sounded. So I would call that like a textural change. I am not adding a new part to the song. I am changing the way that an existing part sounds or can be received. You can see this happen in a lot of different ways. You can have a guitar part where, is this guitar part double tracked? Is it layered with an octave up or an octave down? Is this synth patch layered with another synth patch? Is this drum kit layered with another drum kit? Like all of those elements are what I would call textural changes to the part. And I'm just defining a part as like what you would hand to a musician to play. Like even something weird like this Gate Lab guitar, I would still call that like a part. Like you could hand that to a musician and give it to them and they could play it with like an MPC in like a live band context. But more so I'm thinking of the relationship of all of these different parts and like what spaces are they taking up in the frequency spectrum. So this first guitar, we can see it's like really heavy here in the low end. With this guitar here, it's almost twice as high up. You can see that the low guitar was going around like the 100, like 200 range. This is more like the 300, 400 range. And then this higher sort of like Gate Lab chopped part is up here. It's like an octave above that. So like there's a natural separation between all of these parts just based off of where they sit in the frequency spectrum and what they're playing. So they blend really well when they fit together. And I think what some people struggle with is they will just progressively add more and more parts to something without really any consideration of how they lock in with the rest of the track. Or they'll have an instance where they have a bass part like this, and they'll feel like, oh, it's not giving me everything I want. Let me write another bass line on top of it. And it just sort of like, it starts getting claustrophobic as a production. So getting to a point where you start seeing things as either like textures or parts, I think can be really helpful. Going through some songs that you have and being like, man, this demo doesn't feel as full as I want it to sound like. Maybe go through and find some of the parts that you think are kind of underwhelming right now and see if a textural change is enough to get them in in the right direction. So that could be like this, adding a different sound underneath it. Maybe if it's a guitar line, doubling it with a synth. It could be taking a drum beat that you have and layering it with completely different samples that are dirtier. Or it could be addressing what parts do you have in the song right now. And maybe the solution is you need something that's just a different part. Like if I'm listening to these 3 guitars, and I remove that middle one and I just have this sort of higher one and this lower one. I feel like now there's like a little bit of a mid-range thing that's missing. There's a bit of a timing, like a dun 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 thing that's like missing now. And sometimes you just need to add a different part that's giving you something that you're not currently receiving right now. So it's like a give and take thing. But yeah, I would start looking through your tracks and being like, okay, if I'm not satisfied with the production, do I just need to add a different part? Do I need to add a lead line? Do I need to add a new bass line? Do I need to add a rhythm guitar part on top of the rhythm guitar part that I already have, but voiced it a little bit differently? Because that's the stuff that really makes a production like come to life. Another thing that I think makes productions really cool, and this is a little bit of a less important one, but it's really creative effects. So if you didn't watch the last video, when I made this electric guitar part here, you might listen to that and be like, oh, how did he make that sort of like granular synth sound? But really all I did was grab this CI part, which was a part that I recorded on an acoustic guitar with like a rubber bridge thing going on. And then I just literally took the dry DI, pitch shifted it up an octave in Ableton, and then I ran it through a granular effect called Emergence and rendered it out as audio. And then I threw GateLab on top of it. So if I turn off GateLab, and so if I didn't have GateLab and I just let this track go, I mean, there's a cool element to that in the track, but I really wanted something that was more sparser. So I have this effect called GateLab that I use all the time. It's free, by the way, if you want to grab it. And it's just like a sequenced gate thing. An effect like that just can instantly change the vibe of a track. I have a tab here in Ableton that is just all of like my reverbs, just so I can like grab like the weird ones really quickly. I have another tab that is just sound design, and it is full of weird stuff, like an emulation of a Rat distortion pedal. We have Mick DSP's Futzbox, which you can use to emulate things like a cell phone. I have Tornado from Sugarbytes. It's meant to be like a really weird like effects plugin that you can use for like a live performance and just do stuff like this. You have things like Halftime by Cable Audio that just like half times your audio. But like really creative effects have this ability to take a sound that you have and just sort of recontextualize it. Like you just saw right there, I could use multiple different plugins to turn this, if you want to call it almost like a source sound, this like really sporadic, like glitchy thing that's really soft and natural sounding. I can make it sound like so many different things just by throwing different effects on it. I feel like it can be helpful to almost have like a spice rack of effects. Like have a way that you can get access to effects really quickly. Even if you're just using like your stock ones, that's totally fine. But I think that if you lay it out so that you can have them in these separate tabs so that you can be like, I'm looking for this. You like know where you can look for that stuff. Because I feel like a lot of people, when they go to like their plugin folder, they'll just like start scrolling and be like, what do I have? And they'll just sort of endlessly open stuff, and God forbid you have anything from Waves, because then you're just like, oh, what do I have from Waves? Oh no. So organizing the plugins that you have can be really helpful, and I think that it can really help spice up your production if you have really creative effects that are also really accessible and easy to throw onto whatever you're working on. The last thing I will talk about, which is probably one of the more important things, is performance. So if there's something that I had to point out that would instantly make make me feel like a production is cheap or not that great, if I'm being brutally honest. It's very rarely like, oh, this person didn't choose the right plugin. It's very rarely, oh, this person didn't mix it right. It's very rarely, you know, this doesn't sound like a final mastered track. All of that stuff really doesn't matter. What does tend to make me feel like a track is sort of lackluster is like the performance of the elements in the track. And what I mean by that is when I'm listening to this track here, like it's muted, but like you can tell things are ringing out the way that I want them to. Most of the time when I get tracks from clients who want me to zhuzh up their productions, or people are sending me tracks to get feedback on what I think would be different, it is normally something like, man, you just kind of need to retrack this guitar because strings are ringing out or the dynamics of the track are just kind of all over the place. A really prevalent one, honestly, is like drum MIDI. If you're somebody who is using a lot of like virtual drum kits like Superior Drummer or the Mixwave stuff, those samples can sound really cheap if you're not really the best at programming drum stuff. I actually made a video here specifically for that because it's a massive issue, especially like in the indie pop world where realistic drums are kind of a commonplace thing. You can make really well recorded hi-hats sound really cheap. Here, I'm just gonna show some examples of some stuff here in this video. If you want to watch that full video, you can, but I'll go over the main stuff right here. So like right there, I recorded like some kick drums and stuff like that. But as you can see, like the velocities of these guys are not all the same. Like you can see some of them are top velocity, but some of them are just like kind of not that. And honestly, that's why I prefer to like program my drum stuff with like my fingers on like a MIDI keyboard, just because even though it's not the same as like me playing a real kit or something like that, having the subtle like variation in like how you're playing stuff can actually make a huge difference. Here, let's do some hi-hats. Again, just doing the super quick and dirty. But see, I just took some of these hits. I used the different kinds of articulations that it has for the hi-hat and used that to make a MIDI performance that actually has like a lot of variation to it, and like it's different samples recorded at different points on the kit. So when I play this final drum kit sound together, like, it sounds good. It sounds like a kit, just like a regular drum performance. But let's say if I did this the way that I see a lot of people doing it, where they like punch it all in by MIDI. So all of the kicks and snares are like top velocity. And then I don't see a lot of people using like the multiple articulations on cymbals. I see them doing a lot of like, here's the one hit that's like closer to the kick. So let's just copy and paste that out a bunch. Like, you hear how it instantly sounds like a drum machine, like, versus so like really taking point to make sure the performance of elements, even if they're like programmed, that they feel natural, or at the very least they feel the way you want them to feel. I have no problem with people using this technique for something like a Linn drum machine or some other electronic element. But when you're doing something on like a live drum kit where it's meant to emulate like a live drummer, this feels really weird. And so spending time to nail the performance of stuff is really valuable. Like if I record this bass and I like am not muting strings the right way after I'm done with a note, if my timing's off, but also like if I'm not really clean with how I'm playing it, there's kind of nothing I can do to like make it sound good after the fact. So I would start by looking at what are the elements that you're recording a lot and be like, okay, maybe I need to go on some YouTube and look up some bass lessons. Again, you don't need to look up how to master bass or how to do slap bass, but even just like some basic stuff that you can practice for like 5 minutes a day. Like, okay, how can I cleanly record bass? You can watch that video that I made of like, okay, how do I realistically program drums in a way that sounds natural? Or you can look for something like a drum MIDI kit. A lot of drum software companies have MIDI kits that are like made specifically for their kit. So maybe try starting out a song using the MIDI notes in what they have and then like shifting them around to what you want, because sometimes even that can be a little bit more natural sounding than something like this. But yeah, that's my advice. Those are my tips. If you guys have any other questions or stuff like that, put them down in the comments below. I would love to extrapolate on some stuff if I was unclear. But yeah, once again, guys, thank you for 10,000 subscribers. Here's to more producing stuff. And yeah, I will see you guys next week.